So welcome to Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram. I'm the Director of Product Marketing in our Vmware Cloud Provider business. And today I'm joined by quite a few of us. Some are familiar to the series, others not so much. So we've got Jörg, Gerrit, and Stefan. Let's start with Jörg. Can you give an introduction to yourself, Jörg?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jörg Leef. I'm a technically product manager in Vmware's Cloud business unit.
Thank you. And Gerrit?
Yeah, hi Guy. I'm Gerrit Leer, Cloud Solution Strategist in the Worldwide Multi-Cloud Architecture and Strategy team.
Excellent. And Stefan?
Hi guys, thanks a lot. My name is Stefan and I'm a Solution Architect in VCPP focusing on the modern application portfolio.
What a great segue, Stefan. So we're going to talk about the modern application portfolio today. We're going to really just kind of rewind and go back to some basics because, certainly the feeling I got from the technical advisory board that we held a couple of weeks ago now is that providers really want to get into app modernization and Dev-Ready Cloud, but they're still not very sure on how to get into app modernization, Dev-Ready Cloud. So today we're going to really start by going through some very basic terminology around the stack, what's available. And obviously we're talking about Tanzu. And can anyone remember what Tanzu actually meant? Wasn't it something about a twig or something like that in Swahili? Or I can't remember exactly what it was. No?
I can't remember. I think it has different meanings in different languages actually, but yeah, there is some deeper meaning to it. Yeah.
Comes from Japanese and means a small box.
Oh, okay. I'm completely wrong then. Thanks, Stefan. Okay, great. So we'll go through what's in the small box, and then we'll go into the type of environment that our service providers run with VCD and how they would look at deploying. We won't go into deployment today, but how they would look at what they could deploy with those environments. So let's take it from the top. Gerrit, I think you had some really good slides that would really be good as a sort of placeholder for us to talk around. Do you want to start with your presentation?
Yeah, let me share just a couple of slides on that topic really, because from previous conversations that we had with our partners, turns out that the VMware Tanzu box isn't really that small at all. And there tends to be some confusion around, what Tanzu means, what kind of products are included, and how this all fits into the cloud provider space, right? So first of all, as you already mentioned, Guy, VMware Tanzu is a portfolio of products. It's not one single product. There are multiple different solutions contained under that umbrella term, right?
Yeah.
And if we, look into that VMware Tanzu box, you can see there are, different products. The upper ones are really around building a modern application. The one in the middle, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, is more about running containerized applications. And the darker blue ones on the bottom are really managing the environments where those modern applications run. And, in subsequent sessions, we'll obviously dive deeper into what each of these products do, right?
Yeah.
So these sets of products are also grouped into different Tanzu editions. So these are bundles of products plus some other bits and pieces that we, sell as different Tanzu editions. And the main ones are called Tanzu Basic, which is, the Kubernetes runtime plus some other things. Mm-hmm. Tanzu Standard, which combines the Tanzu Kubernetes runtime with Tanzu Mission Control, so the multi-cloud control plane. And then Tanzu Advanced is really, a whole stack of additional solutions on top of Tanzu Basic and Standard.
And Gerrit, so these are all available, Tanzu Standard, Tanzu Basic, Tanzu Advanced. Are these all available in our cloud provider portfolio for cloud providers to actually utilize?
Not yet, as in terms of general availability. So I'll come to that in the next slide, but in a nutshell, Tanzu Basic is available, Tanzu Standard is coming soon, and Tanzu Advanced today is an exception process. So if partners have a strong demand, we can work on that, but it's not generally available as of today.
Yeah, so I think most of our providers will be definitely looking at starting with the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, and we call that TKG, right? So that's when you hear that acronym, that's what we're talking about. But then if you're looking at doing things like getting into sovereign cloud data lake exchange for GaiaX adapters and things like that, then certainly you'd be looking into more like data services in the advanced portfolio, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really, a maturity journey for our partners, right? So all of them start with Tanzu Basic. This is what we have available today in VCPP, and actually from this point in time at no additional cost, right? So it's 0 points today. Yeah. And then as they mature to multi-cloud or to more advanced services, this is when Tanzu Standard and Tanzu Advanced come in.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, so an additional layer of confusion or complexity is really about what's in that Tanzu Kubernetes grid box that you see in the middle, right? So Tanzu Kubernetes grid, which is really our Kubernetes runtime, right, comes in different flavors, and the two most relevant ones are Tkgs, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service, which is embedded in Vsphere, right? And the second one is TKGM, or Tanzu Kubernetes Grid for multi-cloud, which can really run on any hypervisor or any cloud, right? So this is an additional term to be aware of. TKG comes in different flavors for our partners and customers.
And you can compare it with operating systems. So it's not moving from TKGS to TKGM. It's not moving from Windows to Linux, but it's more the distribution used to provide Kubernetes clusters, like moving from Debian to Red Hat or to SUSE. So it's not complete different technologies there.
Exactly.
Okay. And TKGS was, that's the one that's embedded in our Esxi hypervisor. Does that come by default now inclusive in Vsphere 7 and beyond?
Yeah, so let's actually dive a little bit more on the embedded in Esxi topic, because that causes some questions with our partners and customers as well, right?
Right.
The TKGS, the one that you see here on the slide already, is really Kubernetes running in virtual machines, but it's provisioned and managed in a way that's really integrated into vSphere, right? So it's more about the user experience there. On top of that, we have a thing called vSphere pods, and that's actually an additional feature of Vsphere 7 with Tanzu, where these Kubernetes container pods run directly on Esxi, right? So there's a different way of abstracting that. And both are part of Vsphere 7 with Tanzu. But they're two, similar, but, a little bit different ways of running Kubernetes or running Kubernetes pods on Vsphere 7 with Tanzu. And this is where a lot of, confusion comes in, I believe.
Yeah. So just rewind there. What is the major difference in between TKGS and vSphere pods?
So in TKGS, we have virtual machines running on vSphere. And in these virtual machines, you have those Kubernetes components like worker nodes and master nodes. And on top of that, on the Kubernetes layer, you run the Kubernetes containers or pods. With vSphere pods, these container pods run directly on Esxi. They are virtual machines in and of themselves. There is no layer of Kubernetes worker and master nodes in between that.
Okay. So
you might ask yourself, why not to directly deploy Kubernetes into a virtual machine? But with TKGM as well as with TKGS, we have a deep integration into vSphere technology. So like NSX, like load balancing, like storage, all the tough topics in Kubernetes are integrated into the vSphere environment. And that's the big difference of deploying Kubernetes in VMs or using the Tanzu solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the vSphere pod methodology of using Kubernetes, with that in the actual Esxi, you're avoiding any of that VM overhead that you would have normally, and obviously the associated management with that. Is that where you get the big performance benefits? I remember Pat, I think it was a couple of VMworlds ago, talking about a 16 times performance improvement running it natively in the hypervisor using, I guess that was vSphere pods then.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the differences between running vSphere pods and using TKGS. Even though both are embedded in vSphere, vSphere pods are actually, higher performance, and there is higher degree of isolation between those container workloads, right? Whereas with TKGS, it's a more native kind of way of running Kubernetes, but it's really, that virtual machine layer in between that sort of comes with that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Do you lose any functionality by running the containers in vSphere pods compared to TKGS?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's, not 100% conformance with the upstream Kubernetes way of running containers. I believe this is somewhat in, security policies and, container privileges, which you cannot do in Vsphere pods. So if that's something that your workloads require, then you would need to go for Tkgs, which is 100% upstream conformant, just like TKGM.
Good shout. So if there is interoperability required with other Kubernetes platforms, then you're better off sticking with TKGS. But then if you've got anything really high performance that you want to excel on, then Vsphere pods is one way of doing that. But then you're in a slightly less interoperable environment.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. And indeed, Guy, you touched a very important point that TKGM is compliant to the upstream Kubernetes and is using upstream Kubernetes code. So we are not inventing VMware Kubernetes, but the full vanilla Kubernetes, conform Kubernetes. So there's nothing special and you don't have to learn new things about a VMware Kubernetes. If you know vanilla Kubernetes, it's absolutely fine to use TKGS, TKGM, because everything is compliant with the vanilla Kubernetes.
Okay. And you said TKGM then, so I'm pretty happy now with the concept of TKGS, and TKGM then presents that ability to run Kubernetes in any cloud environment, any other hypervisor environment. Would that be right?
Exactly. So TKGM can basically run anywhere, including, older versions of vSphere, but also, native hyperscale hypervisors or cloud platforms, wherever you want to run it, really.
And how does that work then? If you're going to run it in an alternative hyperscaler or on a different hypervisor, you still have to deploy their kind of VM, and then you deploy TKGM and manage Kubernetes within that environment.
Yeah. And there is a Tanzu management cluster that does part of that for you, right?
Okay. So this is with if your customers then, from a provider perspective, if your customers are looking for that interoperability, but they're predominantly going to stay with a VMware based cloud, then TKGS would be the best kind of solution for them. If they're looking for the performance and they're happy to stay in vSphere, then vSphere pods. But if we're also looking at interoperability and moving those containers to different clouds, maybe for cost reasons or whatever it might be, then TKGM would be a good platform to provide that universal cloud's operational view on the Kubernetes environment.
Yeah, I think that sums it up quite nicely. Yeah.
Okay. May I add the additions, because there's some confusion around TKGM. Is it included in Tanzu Basic? Is it included in Tanzu Standard? And please let me clarify. So in Tanzu Basic, and very simplified with Tanzu Basic, you get all to run your Kubernetes clusters on-prem. So with Tanzu Basic, you get the entitlement to run TKGM clusters on-prem. With Tanzu Standard, you get additionally the entitlement to run TKGM clusters on hyperscalers. And with Tanzu Standard, you get the entitlement to run your Kubernetes workloads on multi-clouds.
As well as getting Tanzu mission control.
Of course, yes. Yeah. I was just speaking about TKG.
So, right, okay. So if you want to run in other hyperscalers, then you need Tanzu Standard, basically.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. All right. So what's the next build out on this one then?
Yeah, so let's just for completeness talk about two other ways that, especially providers can leverage to run Kubernetes, right? And this is TKGI. This stands for TKG Integrated Edition, and it's really the new name for the former PKS Enterprise product. Right. And we have existing providers that use that, right? In some niche cases, it might be the way forward. But really, the majority of providers that we talk to today go down the TKGS or TKGM path, right? And then there's also the option to use upstream free Kubernetes versions, right? Which is free of charge, but obviously does not come with any commercial support from VMware. And all of these four options are supported by VMware Cloud Director and the container service extension, which is important for our providers if they want to offer these Kubernetes editions as a service, right? And you can see in the fine print here that TKGI support is actually being deprecated in the latest CSE version, but with all the versions, TKGI was also an option there.
So, may I give our audience a personal recommendation? When you start today with Tanzu, please do not consider TKGI. Go for TKGM, TKGS.
Yeah. And the reason being because it's being deprecated from the Cloud Director environment.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll come to container service extension a bit more on that in a minute. I just want to zoom in something that you said about support, Gerrit. So when you're looking at when you're a cloud provider, obviously you get production level support included in your Flex core and your points that you consume for whatever product you are consuming. Where does that boundary start and end as far as Kubernetes goes? Do you have any idea of that, of what that is? Because is it a cluster won't start, or there's something wrong operationally with the cluster? How do we kind of diagnose whether that's actually a Kubernetes issue or a TKGMS issue?
Yeah, I mean, TKGM and TKGS are sort of our enterprise Kubernetes flavors, right? So we fully support that product, right? So everything that we have built out of the open source Kubernetes and turned into this TKG product is supported by VMware, right?
Got it. Right.
Now, there's one thing to mention that, in all of these editions, Tanzu Basic, Tanzu Standard, Tanzu Advanced, we also provide some level of support for additional open source products, for example, FluentBit for logging or Prometheus for monitoring. And that support is really, best effort, because those are open source products that we cannot fully support, but we do support, a certain level there because it's part of the editions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we mentioned VMware Cloud Director, and let's just push that aside for a second. What if I'm a service provider who doesn't have Cloud Director? What can I deploy today and use?
Well, today, generally available, we have everything that's in Tanzu Basic, right? So that does not require VCD or CSE. It's a good way to turn this into a self-service, Kubernetes as a service offering, but you can deploy it on Vsphere and sell that as a service as well. So there's really no hard dependency on VMware Cloud Director, right?
So you could sell a TKGS kind of or a Kubernetes cluster service, a dedicated cluster.
Exactly. Yeah. And let's maybe look at the availability on the next slide, right? So when we look at these three editions, Tanzu Basic, Tanzu Standard, and Advanced, we really have Tanzu Basic available today, generally available to anyone. It's in the VCP product usage guide. We have Tanzu Standard coming soon, right? And we also have TMC available as a standalone product via the MSP program. And then Tanzu Advanced is, the exception process. And none of these are really married to VCD, right? So if you choose to deploy dedicated private clouds without VCD, that's totally doable. There is no hard requirement on that.
And what's the overhead if you were going to deploy TKGS or TKGS in a dedicated private environment? What type of overhead are we talking about from a management perspective?
Yeah, so there is this thing called the Supervisor Cluster, right? This is really a 3 VM cluster that does the management of TKGS and the Vsphere pod portion, and this is what you need to run on top of the Vsphere cluster that you want to enable for Tanzu. So 3 virtual machines, and that's then basically the control plane for the Vsphere with Tanzu features.
We are speaking about a few gigabytes of overhead, so it's not that bad. It's not hundreds of gigabytes, but it's tens of gigabytes.
Yeah. That's good to know. All right, so pretty small VMs then. That's not a huge effort. Okay, that's good.
Oh, one important distinction, of course, if you use these Tanzu editions in combination with Cloud Director, then Cloud Director allows you to create that multi-tenancy environment. That means you can have shared resources in the Vsphere platform and use these shared resources for different tenants, and then use Cloud Director and all the mechanisms in terms of quota, resource management, allocation models in Cloud Director to allocate the resources to the different tenants. And you have the self-service capabilities from VCD perspective for the tenants. While when you are running, of course, dedicated clusters or dedicated vSphere environments, then you typically don't have a multi-tenant environment. You would run or deploy, a dedicated cluster for each tenant, which of course limits your resource consolidation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're not going to achieve the economies of scale. You're not going to achieve a nice carbon offset by running multiple customers on the same hardware. So you're not actually being that green either at the same time. So get Cloud Director would be the moral here. But it's good to know there is an option for cloud providers who don't want to get into that environment and don't want to provide multi-tenanted services. Okay. Sorry.
Maybe in addition to, you may have heard during VMworld that there are different packages coming. So like the TKO package for operators, please stay tuned. What's coming there?
Yeah, you meant, and so in terms of different kind of packages and different interfaces with TKG M, or I think on the previous slide you had just something I just want to go back to. Sorry, there you go. So TKGS, TKGM, Tanzu Mission Control. Now, if I'm a service provider providing BCD today, and I'm providing multi-tenanted public cloud services, I've got container service extension deployed, and we'll come to that in a minute. And I'm using TKGM, let's say, for now, because that's the only one that's supported by container service extension. I have Tanzu standards, and I want to use Tanzu Mission Control. Now, Tanzu Mission Control is a SaaS service, so it is not something that's integrated with Cloud Director, right? It would be something that you would have to set up separate access to. Does anyone know if it's via Navigator yet, or is it completely standalone configuration?
Yeah, so it's a SaaS service, as you said. It's run and operated by VMware, and it is integrated in Cloud Partner Navigator. Yeah, so there is no direct integration with VCD, but what you can do is, those CSE provision clusters can be managed by TMC, right, which is sort of the SaaS global control plane for any Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, and so I would have to, as a service provider, then set up my customers, if they wanted to have access to TMC, to manage their Kubernetes clusters in the SaaS portal. I'd actually have to give them access, set their accounts up and everything else, which is another layer of administration just to be aware of, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
From my experience, there are two main use cases for service providers for TMC. One is managed Kubernetes, to use TMC to manage the Kubernetes clusters internally. And secondly, to provide Tanzu Mission Control to their customers to act more as a cloud broker.
Talk me through that, Stefan. What do you mean by act as a cloud broker?
So you will enable your customers and will offer your customers a multi-cloud Kubernetes management tool, and would expose TMC as a service provider to your end customers to act as a broker. So you enable your customers to use whatever hyperscaler they want to use for their Kubernetes workloads and ensure compliance and so on. But I guess this is topic of another session.
Yeah, sure. We'll dive into that into another session. And that opens up some interesting use cases. But yeah, let's focus that for another day. Today, let's keep it simple. So we're looking at Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. We're looking at options for TKGS or TKGM. And really, when we're looking at Cloud Director with Container Service Extension, which is the plugin that Cloud Director uses to communicate to the Kubernetes layer to TKG, it's really only TKGM now, right? That was in the latest 3.1.1 update, I think, of Container Service Extension.
Yeah, one of you want to take that one?
Yes, I can take it. So with the latest CSE version, so when I'm explaining CSE, I see CSE as two components. So we have one UI component, and as of vCloud Director 10.3, the UI component is already included in Cloud Director.
Yeah.
So the UI component is needed whenever you want to provide Kubernetes clusters out of VCD. So when you want to provide TKGS clusters, TKGM clusters, native clusters, upstream Kubernetes clusters, the UI component already included into Cloud Director is needed. When you want to deploy upstream Kubernetes or TKGM, the CSE server is needed. CSE server is a small Linux server with a Python component managing and creating the Kubernetes clusters and coordinating all steps necessary to provide the Kubernetes clusters and to ensure the integration into the VMware technologies. For example, like RV load balancing, NSX, storage integration, and so on.
Okay, and TKGM, well, when CSE was originally, when 3.0 or 3.1 of CSE, it did support TKGS, and then we had to do some funky stuff with NSX to support, I think it was into group routing between the clusters and the external networks. Now, TKGM is the only supported option with CSE 3.1.1. Is that correct?
Yes, with the
Right.
CSE server. The UI component supports TKGS, supports all Kubernetes integrations into VCD.
So I'm not quite sure why then, is TKGS not going to be something that's supported by CSE? Does it need to be supported by CSE, or is our strategy now just to get TKGM working because it has much more value associated with it?
Yeah, so that's something I think technically we need the CSE server as a component in the middle to talk to TKGM because of the different architecture in TKGM. With TKGM, since it is multi-cloud, we have the whole management plane being independent from Vsphere. While with TKGS, all the APIs that are needed to, for example, deploy new clusters are part of the Vsphere or vCenter API. And therefore, for TKGS, VCD can directly talk to vCenter, which is already connected as a provider VDC to make these calls to create new clusters. While with TKGM, it's a different component, and therefore we need that small part with the CSE server as a man in the middle to do that, to do these API calls. However, important to understand is that from a user experience, that all does not matter, because with the user experience, you get this UI plugin that Stefan mentioned to create and manage your the lifecycle of your Kubernetes clusters, and that is the same wizard or the same user experience no matter what backend is being used.
Yes,
it's always the same, the same dialogues that you have, and depending on which backend is activated for which organization, you just get the selection with either native, upstream Kubernetes or TKGM based Kubernetes or TKGS based Kubernetes cluster.
And that's a great point, Jörg, because if you wouldn't tell your customers and would remove the labels, the customers wouldn't notice which method of providing Kubernetes clusters are actually used.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense now, right? So let me just rewind this for my slow brain. We have VCD, and containers are really a first-class citizen now in VCD since 10.x. CSE is required even if you're using TKGS and TKGM because it's providing the UI in both, but also it's providing some of the translation and backend for TKGM, whereas the UI will talk directly via VCD and CSE to the vCenter and do the Kubernetes commands if it's TKGS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I got it.
Right. Correct. Excellent. And to add, well, not more confusion, but more flexibility, you can mix and match all these different options. So within the same VCD environment, you can have the different endpoints. And as usual in VCD, we allow a granularity based on org or org VDC to activate the different endpoints. So as a service provider, you can decide which of the different options you want to enable for which org VDC of your tenant, and can make that, your business according to your business models.
And one thing I was really fascinated of is that vCloud Director now recognizes that if TKGS is enabled, so if Vsphere with Tanzu is enabled, it's just consuming the resources, underlying resources as without Kubernetes, and vCloud Director just sees, okay, Kubernetes is enabled and configures it accordingly. For TKGS, there's no need of additional configuration needed, or minimal additional configuration.
Okay. Yeah, that's the benefits of, well, having TKGS integrated that deep into Vsphere, because then in Vsphere there are policy-based management in the Vsphere APIs, and then VCD can use these policies in the same way as it has been using, for example, storage policies for a long time now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what about things like persistent disks and persistent storage? Just now that you mentioned storage, that I know was brought out in 3.1.1, I believe, of CSE. Does that apply then both to TKGS and to TKGM?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so you mentioned something which is probably worthwhile discussing now. You mentioned the kind of the business aspect of it. So what I've identified now is I'm a service provider, I've got VCD, I've now got an understanding of the components I need and the license model I need. What about the additional things like, before we get to what sort of services, how about the metering of the environment? Tenant app obviously is our key to how we do the metering and monitoring of the services. That is covering both TKGS, TKGM?
That is currently, covering the TKG S integration with VROps for the metering and for the billing. But it's has been introduced, I think, in Tenant App 2.5, so pretty new and pretty basic with the metering and the chargeback based on their container clusters.
Yeah. And really, I mean, Garrett, from your experience, right, what the service providers are talking to you about providing its Kubernetes cluster as a service. Is that the main kind of service portfolio they're looking at?
Yeah, so the model is usually that you offer your customers a Kubernetes cluster, right? And they can, pick and choose the number of worker nodes and also the number of master nodes if they want this to be highly available or not, right? So master nodes depend on, how many worker nodes you want to manage, and then you need those worker nodes to run the containers, right? Yeah. And those are basically all virtual machines. So our partners would typically charge based on the number and size of virtual machines that build this Kubernetes cluster.
So from our perspective, it's still a VRAM kind of based consumption model.
Exactly, and also for our providers, this has become easier with TKGM and the price reduction of Tanzu Basic, right? Because in the past, when we only had TKGS, you would need NSX-T Advanced underneath. You would have to pay that additional point for NSX and the additional point for Tanzu Basic. Mm-hmm. And now with TKGM, it's really the same price point for the provider as with any normal virtual machine, right? Because you don't need an additional NSX-T edition, and you don't need to pay an extra for Tanzu Basic.
Right, so that's all included in the model, and things like if you were going to start upselling like container ingress, firewalling with the advanced load balancer, does that come as well included in? Obviously, that's something that needs to be configured. I don't think that's available in VCD today. How would that get charged? Would that be an optional extra, and how would that relate to how the service provider gets charged?
Yeah, so that depends on what they're actually using, right? So the NSX Advanced Load Balancer in the Basic Edition, that's part of NSX-T anyways. Yeah. If they want to use the enterprise features of RV, of NSX Advanced Load Balancer, then this would be charged according to the product usage guide. Mm-hmm. In Tanzu Advanced, once that's GA, there's actually an inclusion of RV Enterprise. And then for load balancing and ingress, there are also other options that partners are considering, like HA proxy or all these additional open source solutions that you have, Contour. So there's really full flexibility, and NSX, if that's the choice, would be charged as with any other environment as well.
basically with Tanzu Basic, you will get the load balancing capabilities up to layer 4 load balancing. So no application-aware layer 7 load balancing, but up to port load balancing, layer 4 load balancing, it's included in Tanzu Basic.
Right. Okay. And if you wanted to go further, that would be standard advanced, would it, or standard for layer 7?
Yeah, so that would, in Tanzu Advanced, we have RV included, but you could also, purchase RV separately from the product usage guide, right? And that then provides features that you mentioned. Okay.
Okay, cool. All right. So that seems to make a lot of sense. So when we now look at, things like VMware Cloud on AWS, right? So I believe in the latest release, it's now supporting Tanzu. Is there, if I was going to be using Cloud Director Service, and apologies if this catches you off guard, this question, but can Cloud Director Service communicate to VMware Cloud and AWS, Tkgs, I guess it is, I'm not sure, and provision via CSC and Cloud Director Service?
That's a question.
Yeah, so that's something I think we have on the roadmap, but with the different operational model of how VMware manages these VMC clusters, it's not, when it comes to that, a bit comparable to the NSXT functionality in Cloud Director Service and VMC on AWS. Currently, we don't support the Tanzu integration directly, but that is on the roadmap and being worked on for sure.
Okay, but if cloud providers had customers who wanted to run Kubernetes in other clouds, they can obviously, there's two ways of doing that. They could do that within that other cloud provider, totally isolated, and just fill their boots, or you look at using TKGM and then have that operational control across the entire environment being the same. Explain how does that happen then? When we're talking about operational control, am I then communicating via VCD, CSC, TKGM, and then into another completely separate environment that might be in AWS or Azure or somewhere else?
Yeah, so for that, you have in the TKGM architecture, the management layer that has components in with the Supervisor Cluster that's being talked to by CSE and VCD from that perspective. And then we have these other components, part of the management layer in the multi-cloud environment, where TKGM talks to these other cloud layers to deploy the necessary nodes there, worker nodes there.
Okay, so I see. So it is then a single interface into that supervisor cluster, which will then talk across to your other environments, wherever they may be. Okay, so that makes good sense. Okay, anything else to cover for today? I think that was pretty much everything we had on the agenda. Any final thoughts of people? And we'll move on to the next day's topic. Garrett, you look like you can say something.
Yeah, the only thing that came up in recent conversations since we announced Tanzu Community Edition is, what role does that play in VCPP, right? So Tanzu Community Edition is basically our free community-supported version of Tanzu, and especially Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. And really for providers, there is really no productization play with Tanzu Community Edition, because Tanzu Basic is basically available free of charge, right?
Yeah.
But from a sales perspective, Tanzu Community Edition can help our partners have that conversation with their customers, right? And let them try Tanzu features and Tanzu components free of charge, right? So this is really where Tanzu Community Edition can help our partners get their customer developers familiar with Tanzu and experience the value without investing any money. And then once they're convinced, move to the partners platform, which is then based on Tanzu Basic, Standard, or Advanced. So this is another question that came up since we announced TCE, the Community Edition.
That's interesting. So you'll be also, from a partner perspective, you're dealing with a whole different buyer now. This is talking to the customers, developers really, and getting them engaged to use Tanzu, which, like you say, Community Edition could really help in that respect.
Yeah, that's the whole point behind Community Edition, right? We want to get engaged with the developer community. We want them to experience the features, the product, and provide feedback to us, right? And this is also what our partners can leverage in their sales motion.
Yeah, brilliant. Gentlemen, well, listen, thank you very much. It's been a really useful high-level overview of the Tanzu portfolio. And this is, for everyone watching, this is the first in a series of Tanzu episodes we're going to do. I believe next time we're going to dive more into Tanzu Kubernetes Grid for Vsphere, or service, sorry, Tkgs. And yeah, hold tight for more in the series. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guy.
Thank you.
Cheers.